The buckboard wagon jolted violently as its left wheel caught the tripwire stretched across the Wyoming prairie trail, hurling 20-year-old Daisy Miller face first into thick, black mud. Her traveling dress ripped at the shoulder as she tumbled, and the leather satchel containing her father's surveying work flew from her grip, landing with a wet thud in the September mire of 1887. Jake Morrison, the teamster hired in Cheyenne to transport her the final 60 miles to Sable Junction, lay crushed beneath the overturned wagon. His neck bent at a fatal angle, brown eyes staring at the afternoon sky. The brass wire glinted in sunlight. Deliberate murder disguised as accident, executed with the cold precision of men who had done this before. The wagon's contents scattered across the prairie, her traveling trunk split open, revealing carefully folded dresses, now muddy and torn. Her mother's silver hairbrush glinting in the dirt, and Robert's surveying instruments spilled from their protective case. The brass compass she'd watched him use countless times lay half-buried in alkali dust, its face cracked but still readable. Hoofbeats pounded across the flatlands like approaching thunder. Two riders emerged from the east, their mounts kicking up alkali dust that hung motionless in the still air. Daisy pushed herself upright on scraped elbows, spitting grit and tasting blood where her teeth had cut her lip. A gash above her left eyebrow sent crimson streams down her cheek, the salt mixing with tears she couldn't control. "Well, looky what we caught, Deadshot," called the first rider, dismounting with practiced ease. Greasy Pete was a wiry man with rotting teeth and a brass deputy's whistle hanging from his vest, the same whistle Daisy remembered seeing at her adoptive father's funeral in Philadelphia 2 weeks earlier. His clothes reeked of unwashed wool and tobacco juice, and his pale eyes held the calculating coldness of a man who killed for wages. The second man stayed mounted, his Colt Navy already drawn, and aimed with steady hands. Deadshot was lean as a whip with hollow cheeks and the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much frontier violence. "Grab them papers, Pete." Boss said she'd be carrying survey documents worth more than silver to certain interested parties. Daisy's heart hammered as comprehension struck like lightning. These weren't chance road agents preying on travelers. They'd orchestrated this ambush with military precision, knowing exactly what she carried when she'd travel this isolated territorial road, and how to make her death appear accidental. Someone had planned this murder down to the smallest detail. She lunged for her satchel just as Pete's boot crashed down on her wrist. Pain blazed up her arm like molten steel. But she wouldn't release the leather bag holding Robert Miller's final investigation evidence that had already cost her adoptive father his life, and might be the only thing standing between justice and complete corruption in Wyoming territory. "I'm filthy." She sobbed, mud streaming down her face as she stared up at her attackers. Shame at her appearance mixed with terror in equal measure. Back in Philadelphia, no lady would be caught in such a degrading state. But here survival mattered more than social propriety. "Don't touch me. Please, I beg you." Pete laughed, showing brown tooth stumps that spoke of a lifetime of poor nutrition and poorer hygiene. "Ain't about touching, girl. It's about them territorial surveys your daddy shouldn't have been drawing." He seized her hair and yanked her head back until her neck strained against the pressure. Deputy Pierce wants every scrap Robert Miller left behind, every map, every calculation, every witness statement that might cause trouble for certain business arrangements. Malcolm Pierce don't forget debts. Deadshot added with casual menace, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who delivered similar threats countless times. "And he sure don't appreciate folks poking around territorial business that don't concern them. Your daddy learned that lesson the hard way." A rifle shot cracked across the prairie like divine judgment, the sound echoing off distant buttes and mesas. Deadshot's hat flew from his head in a shower of felt and sweat, and his horse reared in panic, nearly unseating him. All three turned toward the sound, and Daisy's breath caught at what emerged from the broken landscape. A Cheyenne warrior materialized from the dry creek beds to the north, guiding his paint horse with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He appeared 25 or so, with broad shoulders earned through frontier hardship and a jagged scar running from elbow to wrist, testament to violence survived and overcome. His long black hair hung past his shoulders, bound with leather strips decorated with small brass ornaments that caught the afternoon light. His Spencer carbine still wisped smoke from its recent discharge, the weapon held with the easy competence of someone who'd used it many times before. Blue and white beadwork decorated his buckskin shirt in geometric patterns that spoke of tribal tradition and personal artistry, while a bone-handled knife hung at his belt alongside a small medicine pouch made from soft doe skin. But it was his eyes that held Daisy's attention dark, as winter nights but alive with intelligence that seemed to catalog every detail of the violent tableau unfolding before him. There was something in his gaze that spoke of justice, delayed but not forgotten, of old grievances that demanded settlement. "Release the woman," he called in clear English that carried easily across the flats, his voice holding quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "She has committed no offense deserving such treatment." Deadshot cursed creatively in frontier vernacular and swung his Colt toward the newcomer, but the warrior was already in motion. He flowed from his saddle like water downhill, inevitable, unstoppable, guided by reflexes honed through years of frontier survival. Pete maintained his grip on Daisy's hair while raising his skinning knife, attempting to use her as a human shield. But when the blade approached her throat, the warrior's restraint evaporated completely. 20 yards became 10 in a handful of heartbeats. The warrior moved with economy born of hard experience, intercepting Pete's desperate slash with his rifle stock. The impact jarred both men's arms to the shoulder, sending vibrations through the Spencer's walnut furniture. Then he drove the weapon's brass butt plate into Pete's solar plexus, with surgical precision targeting the nerve cluster that would cause maximum incapacitation. Pete doubled over like a broken jackknife, gasping and retching in the alkaline mud, while his knife spun away into the sagebrush. His face had gone the color of old parchment, and blood frothed at the corners of his mouth as he struggled to draw breath. "This ain't finished." Pete wheezed between violent coughs, struggling to regain his feet while clutching his injured stomach. "Deputy Malcolm Pierce, don't forget interference with territorial law enforcement. You've made yourself a powerful enemy today, Redskin." He stumbled toward his horse, while Deadshot provided covering fire, both men retreating toward cottonwoods that marked a seasonal creek. Their mounts kicked up clouds of dust as they fled, but Deadshot turned in his saddle to deliver a parting threat that carried clearly across the prairie. "Pierce knows about you now. He'll come calling with a full posse, and when he does, you'll wish you'd stayed on the reservation where you belong." The warrior watched them disappear into the grove, rifle ready, but no longer aimed. Only when the last echoes of hoofbeats had faded across the vast landscape did he turn his full attention to Daisy, who sat clutching her precious satchel like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. She was trembling uncontrollably, now delayed shock setting in as the immediate danger receded. Tears had carved clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks, and her green eyes reflected a mixture of gratitude and profound shame at her bedraggled condition. Her once neat traveling dress was now torn and mud-stained, her carefully arranged hair hanging in tangles around her face. "I'm filthy," she whispered again, her voice breaking like thin ice over deep water. "No decent person should have to see me in such a disgraceful state. I must look like some common vagrant." The warrior knelt beside her with movements as deliberate and gentle as a man approaching a wounded deer in deep forest. Without speaking, he pulled a clean bandana from his shirt pocket, blue cotton worn soft from countless washings, and moistened it with water from his decorated canteen. The metal container bore brass studs, arranged in a pattern that might have been stars or might have been wildflowers, depending on how the light struck them. With infinite patience, born of experience tending injured creatures, he used 2 fingers to brush the worst of the mud and prairie grass from her tangled auburn hair. Each movement was precise, but tender, removing debris without causing additional pain to her already traumatized scalp. His touch was so gentle, it seemed almost reverent, as if he understood that her dignity was as important as her physical wounds. Mud reveals nothing of a person's true worth, he said quietly, dabbing the damp cloth against her wounded forehead with the gentleness of falling snow. Eyes show real character, and yours speak of courage under fire, not shame. His own eyes were deep brown, flecked with gold like sunlight, filtering through amber bottles, and they held no judgment, only steady compassion that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. He cleaned the dirt from her cheek with the same careful attention he might devote to grooming his horse or preparing a ceremonial pipe, each gesture conveying respect rather than pity. The contrast between his calloused hands and gentle touch created an island of safety in Daisy's traumatized mind. Here was someone who understood violence, but chose kindness, who possessed the physical power to inflict harm, but used it instead to heal and protect the innocent. "What is your name?" he asked, continuing to tend her injuries, while she watched him with growing wonder. "Daisy Miller." She managed, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was traveling to Sable Junction to settle my father's estate and continue his work. My adoptive father," she corrected, though the distinction felt increasingly meaningless. Robert Miller had raised her with more love and attention than many natural daughters ever received. The warrior nodded once, neither pressing for additional details nor dismissing her obvious distress. "I am called Hayamovi. In the language of my people it means High Chief, though these days I lead no one but myself and answer to no authority except my own conscience." He glanced meaningfully at her satchel, which she still clutched with white-knuckled determination. Those road agents spoke of Deputy Malcolm Pierce with considerable fear and respect. That name carries dark weight throughout this territory. The way he pronounced Pierce's name carried undertones of personal knowledge, as if their paths had crossed before, under circumstances neither pleasant nor easily forgotten. His slight emphasis on the deputy's title suggested familiarity with the man's reputation for violence cloaked in legal authority. They said he wanted Robert's survey papers. Daisy forced herself to focus on practical matters despite her emotional turmoil. "My father spent the final months of his life documenting irregularities in territorial land records around Ghost Creek. He believed someone was systematically stealing water rights from legitimate users for illegal profit." "Your father was Robert Miller, the territorial surveyor." Something in Hayamovi's tone made her look up sharply, seeing recognition and perhaps respect in his dark eyes. "The man who mapped disputed territories near Echo Canyon and documented traditional tribal water sources." "You knew him?" "I knew of his work and reputation. He was one of the few white officials who dealt honestly with tribal representatives regarding traditional water sources and seasonal camping grounds. His surveys acknowledged Cheyenne usage patterns that other government men preferred to ignore." Hayamovi's expression grew somber, as clouds gathering before a storm. "His death was officially reported as a surveying accident, but many in my community suspected otherwise." As he helped her to her feet, his hands strong and steady despite their gentleness, Daisy felt something remarkable happening in her chest. The paralyzing terror that had gripped her since the ambush was slowly receding, replaced by hope mixed with grim determination to see justice done. "We must leave this place quickly," Hayamovi said, scanning the horizons with eyes trained to detect distant threats. "Men like Pete rarely work alone. and they'll return with reinforcements after reporting their failure to their employer. This country offers little cover for anyone trying to avoid pursuit. His paint horse stood patiently nearby, magnificent animal with intelligent brown eyes, and the deep chest marking superior breeding for endurance work. The horse's coat showed the distinctive patches of white and brown that gave paint horses their name, while its alert ears and calm demeanor spoke of careful training and strong bonds with its rider. As Hayamovi helped Daisy mount behind him, she glimpsed something carved into his rifle scabbard that quickened her pulse with new understanding. Traditional Cheyenne markers indicated safe passage through territorial boundaries, symbols she recognized from Robert's field notes documenting legitimate tribal claims to disputed lands. You and Robert worked together somehow, she realized as they began moving toward the distant Sable Junction and the town barely visible as a smudge of smoke on the southern horizon. Indirectly, but with mutual respect, Hayamovi confirmed guiding his paint at a steady pace that would cover ground without exhausting the animal. Your father understood that accurate surveys required knowledge of traditional land use patterns. He consulted tribal elders before finalizing his maps, ensuring his work reflected actual usage rather than theoretical boundaries drawn by men who'd never seen the country they claimed to govern. The paint carried them both easily across the broken landscape toward town, responding to Hayamovi's subtle guidance, with the kind of partnership that came only from years of shared experience. The September afternoon was warm, but carried hints of approaching winter in the high desert air, when snow would make travel dangerous and survival would depend on careful preparation and stored supplies. They traversed harsh country that possessed its own austere beauty, red sandstone formations carved by ancient waters into fantastic shapes, sagebrush releasing its sharp medicinal fragrance, when disturbed by their passage distant mountains rising like purple promises against the infinite sky. Hawks circled overhead in lazy spirals, riding thermal currents with ancient patience, while jackrabbits bounded through sparse vegetation like brown ghosts fleeing some invisible predator. The silence between them was comfortable, rather than awkward, filled with the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the soft creak of leather saddle gear. Daisy found herself studying the country through new eyes, seeing it not just as empty wasteland, but as a complex ecosystem that supported life for those who understood its rhythms and respected its harsh demands. "Tell me about Deputy Pierce," Daisy said as they rode, needing to understand the nature and scope of the threats they faced. "What kind of man are we dealing with?" Hayamovi chose his words with the careful precision that marked frontier survivors, understanding that careless speech could prove fatal in a territory where information was currency and trust was a luxury few could afford. Malcolm Pierce arrived in Wyoming Territory 3 years ago with credentials from Kansas state authorities and written recommendations from influential officials in Topeka. He began his voice carrying over the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. He presented himself as an experienced lawman seeking to bring order to lawless regions where territorial government had failed to establish effective control. But you don't believe that's the complete truth. Pierce is exactly what he claims to be, an experienced lawman with genuine skills and legitimate authority. The question is whether he serves the law faithfully or uses his position for personal advantage and private profit. Hayamovi guided the paint around patches of alkali that could injure horse hooves with their caustic properties. Since his arrival in Sable Junction, several men who opposed certain powerful business interests have died in what Sheriff Magnus officially ruled as accidents, natural causes, or random violence. Including Robert? Possibly. Your father was actively investigating territorial water rights irregularities at the time of his death, focusing specifically on discrepancies between filed claims and actual land usage around Ghost Creek watershed. Such investigations threatened the substantial profits of men who'd invested heavily in controlling those water resources through questionable legal means. As Sable Junction appeared ahead of them, gradually resolving from heat, shimmer into actual buildings, Daisy's stomach tightened with mixed anticipation and dread. The town occupied a natural basin, where the railroad spur met the main stage road, its collection of weathered wooden buildings clustered around the depot like chicks seeking protection near their mother hen. But it was the massive industrial complex dominating the northern district that commanded attention and quickened her pulse with apprehension. Victor Mendez's stamp mill rose above the residential areas like a mechanical cathedral dedicated to industrial progress, its steam-powered ore crushers producing constant rhythmic thunder that could be heard for miles across the prairie. The mill's wooden framework stretched several stories into the sky, supported by massive timbers that spoke of substantial investment and permanent intentions. Smoke poured from multiple stacks at all hours, visible evidence of the 24-hour operations that had made Victor Mendez among Wyoming Territory's wealthiest and most influential men. Behind the mill, Victor's dam stretched across Ghost Creek like a wooden fortress wall, its spillway gates controlling water flow that powered the industrial machinery, while simultaneously starving the downstream valley of irrigation, essential for agricultural survival. The engineering was impressive, but the consequences were devastating for anyone dependent on the creek's natural flow. There, over south, Hayamovi pointed toward a modest white building with a bell tower that stood apart from the town's commercial district. The schoolhouse where Miss Beatrice Hawthorne teaches. She has a reputation for helping travelers in distress without asking uncomfortable questions about their circumstances or business. Riding down Sable Junction's main street, a muddy thoroughfare lined with wooden sidewalks and hitching posts, Daisy felt the weight of curious and hostile stares following their progress. The town's population was clearly unaccustomed to seeing a white woman traveling in the company of a Cheyenne warrior, and their reactions ranged from mere curiosity to outright hostility. Miners lounging outside Murphy's saloon interrupted their afternoon card game to watch them pass, their expressions ranging from simple interest to open suspicion. Several made comments she couldn't quite hear, but understood perfectly from their tone and body language. The tension in the air was palpable, like the atmospheric pressure before a violent thunderstorm. Near Hoffman's General Store, a well-dressed man in an expensive wool coat paused his conversation with the German proprietor to study them with calculating eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything they saw. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly groomed despite the frontier setting, and his neatly trimmed Van Dyke beard framed a face that spoke of both intelligence and ruthless determination. Gold watch chains gleamed across his silk vest, and his polished leather boots bore no trace of prairie dust, clear indicators of wealth and social position in a community where most men wore rough work clothes and mud-caked footgear. Everything about his appearance proclaimed prosperity and power, from his confident posture to the way other townspeople seemed to defer to his presence. Victor Mendez. Hayamovi murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of their horses' hooves on packed earth. The man whose illegal water diversions have systematically stolen irrigation from Cheyenne hunting grounds and settler farms throughout the valley. Victor touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of polite acknowledgement, but his dark eyes held no warmth as they catalogued details of Daisy's disheveled appearance and her unusual choice of traveling companion. She felt uncomfortably evaluated like livestock at auction, her potential value weighed with the practiced efficiency of someone who viewed people primarily as assets or obstacles. Beatrice Hawthorne met them at the schoolhouse door before they could even dismount, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her blue eyes immediately focusing on Daisy's obvious injuries with professional concern. She appeared to be in her mid-30s with ink stains on her fingers from countless hours grading students' arithmetic and the kind of quiet authority that came from years successfully managing both children and their often difficult parents. Her simple gray dress was well maintained, but clearly not fashionable, and her posture spoke of the economical movements necessary for someone who performed dozens of small tasks throughout each day. But Daisy noticed deeper details that suggested complexities beneath the surface advanced mathematics texts visible on her desk that indicated education far beyond elementary teaching requirements. Most intriguingly, there was a telegraph key mounted in the corner of the room connected to wires that ran outside through a small hole near the window. The equipment looked sophisticated for a frontier schoolroom, suggesting communication capabilities that went beyond simple educational needs. "Merciful heavens, child, what happened to you?" Beatrice asked, taking in Daisy's mud-caked condition and the dried blood on her forehead. "You look like you've been dragged behind runaway horses across half the territory." Road agents ambushed her wagon on the prairie road. Hayamovi explained, simply helping Daisy dismount, while his eyes continued scanning the streets for potential threats. They killed her driver and attempted to steal documents she was transporting to settle her father's estate. Beatrice's expression immediately grew more serious as she grasped the implications of what she was hearing. "Come inside, both of you. That cut needs proper medical attention, and we should discuss what brought you to our community before word of your arrival spreads any further." The schoolhouse interior met most of Daisy's expectations. children's slate boards stacked neatly on wooden desks, a large territorial map mounted prominently on one wall, and the pervasive smell of chalk dust mixed with the leather and ink scents that marked any place dedicated to education and learning. Arithmetic problems covered the blackboard in Beatrice's precise handwriting, while shelves along the walls held McGuffey's readers' spelling books and the accumulated materials of frontier education. But closer observation revealed details that spoke of Beatrice's character and possibly hidden purposes that went beyond simple teaching. The advanced mathematics texts she'd noticed outside included comprehensive works on surveying techniques and civil engineering that seemed far beyond elementary educational requirements. A locked cabinet in one corner bore no external markings, but was secured with an unusually sophisticated lock mechanism that suggested valuable contents. Most significantly, the telegraph key she'd spotted was connected to a sanctioned drop line from the main territorial circuit, officially permitted by the Sable Junction postal office, to serve community educational needs with evening and weekend operations handled by Samuel Kowalski, the Polish immigrant, who doubled as night telegraph operator and schoolhouse custodian. Beatrice cleared her desk with brisk efficiency, helping Daisy sit while she prepared medical supplies from a well-stocked cabinet. Her movements suggested considerable experience, treating injuries more serious than typical playground scrapes, and her questions about Daisy's condition demonstrated medical knowledge that exceeded what most frontier school teachers would possess. "Now then," Beatrice said, beginning to clean Daisy's wounds with professional competence. "Tell me about these documents that men were apparently willing to commit murder to obtain." Daisy opened her leather satchel with hands that still trembled slightly from shock and exhaustion, her heart racing as she wondered whether anything might be missing from its precious contents. Relief flooded through her as she carefully inventoried the materials: rolled maps secured with ribbon ties, folded legal documents bearing official seals, and Robert's thick field notebook filled with precise handwriting and technical drawings that represented months of dangerous investigative work. She spread the largest map across Beatrice's desk, its edges yellow from extensive handling, and its surface marked with the meticulous detail that characterized all of Robert's professional work. The document showed Ghost Creek and the surrounding territory according to original territorial surveys, with every bend, tributary and elevation change recorded with mathematical precision that left no room for error or misinterpretation. My adoptive father, Robert Miller, was a territorial surveyor employed by the Federal Land Office. She began, her voice growing stronger and more confident as she focused on factual details rather than emotional trauma. During the final 8 months of his life, he conducted an extensive investigation into discrepancies between original territorial surveys and current land use patterns throughout the Ghost Creek watershed. Hayamovi studied the map with the familiarity of someone who had traveled every mile of the depicted territory on foot and horseback. This line here represents the creek's natural course as it flows through Echo Canyon, where my people have maintained seasonal hunting camps for generations beyond memory. Those deep pools never freeze completely, even in the harshest winters, making them absolutely essential for survival during the coldest months. Exactly right. Daisy confirmed producing additional documents bearing official territorial seals and notary stamps that validated their legal authenticity under territorial and federal law. But compare Robert's accurate survey work with this second document. She unfolded another map, showing dramatically different boundary lines and watercourse markings. This is the version that was officially filed with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, and it's the legal foundation supporting Victor Mendez's extensive water rights claims. Beatrice leaned forward, her educated eye immediately grasping the serious implications as she compared the two documents side by side. The filed version shows the creek's natural course running nearly 2 miles east of its actual location. That would place Victor's dam and mill operations entirely on his own private property, rather than on public territorial land. Robert's investigation proved that someone had systematically altered survey markers throughout the region, physically moved boundary stones from their original positions, and forged territorial documents to support completely false legal claims. Daisy continued spreading out additional evidence across the desk. He documented at least 12 specific instances where water rights were illegally transferred from legitimate public use to private commercial control. She showed them Robert's photographs, actual images captured using the complex wet plate photography process that required carrying a complete portable darkroom on surveying expeditions. The pictures provided undeniable visual evidence of boundary stones that had clearly been moved from their original positions, with the authentic locations still marked by permanent depressions in the earth, where the heavy stone markers had rested undisturbed for years. These photographs required nearly an hour each to prepare and expose properly, followed by another full hour developing the glass plates in his portable darkroom under completely controlled conditions. Daisy explained, her voice reflecting both pride in Robert's dedication and sorrow for his ultimate fate. The wet plate photographic process demanded that he coat each glass plate with collodion solution, sensitize it in silver nitrate baths, expose it while still chemically wet, then immediately develop the image before the emulsion dried and became unusable. The technical demands of frontier photography made Robert's systematic documentation even more remarkable. Each photograph represented hours of careful preparation, precise chemical timing, and significant physical risk as he transported fragile equipment across dangerous territory where discovery could mean death. Hayamovi examined the photographs with particular interest, his experienced eyes recognizing landmarks and geographical features from his own extensive travels through the disputed territory. Your father was extraordinarily thorough in his investigative methods. These images provide absolutely irrefutable proof of systematic boundary manipulation that has been ongoing for years. But that's not even the most damning evidence Robert uncovered. Daisy said, her excitement growing as she displayed her father's most shocking discoveries. He determined that this exact same pattern of systematic fraud has been repeated throughout Wyoming territory and possibly in neighboring regions. Victor Mendez isn't just a local criminal, he's a key participant in a much larger conspiracy designed to steal water rights from legitimate users across the entire American West. A shadow suddenly fell across the schoolhouse doorway, interrupting their increasingly urgent analysis. Sheriff Clarence Magnus filled the opening with his considerable bulk, effectively blocking the afternoon light that had been illuminating their work. He was a large man in his 50s with graying hair and the soft physical appearance that came from years of accepting regular gratuities while carefully avoiding genuinely dangerous confrontations with serious criminals. Behind Magnus stood Deputy Malcolm Pierce, and Daisy felt her blood turn cold as she got her first clear look at the man whose name had been spoken with such obvious fear by the road agents who'd tried to kill her. Pierce appeared to be perhaps 40 years old with pale blue eyes that seemed to systematically catalog every detail of the room's contents and occupants. His thin frame was deceptively slight, but his movements carried the controlled precision of someone extensively trained in violence and comfortable using it when necessary. Most unsettling about Pierce was his smile, a facial expression that never seemed to reach his cold eyes, suggesting constant amusement at private jokes that others weren't privileged to understand. When his calculating gaze fixed directly on Daisy, she felt exactly like a small prey animal that had just attracted the unwelcome attention of a particularly intelligent and patient predator. Pierce's pale eyes swept the room systematically and professionally, carefully noting window placement for potential escape routes, observing the back door's location for tactical planning, mentally evaluating defensive positions that might be available to future occupants. His right hand rested near his gun belt with a kind of casual readiness that suggested long experience with frontier violence and complete confidence in his ability to handle any situation that might arise. "Afternoon, Miss Hawthorne," Magnus said, touching his hat brim with elaborate courtesy, while his eyes remained constantly watchful for signs of deception or resistance. "Heard there was some kind of serious trouble on the territorial road earlier today. Figured we should take proper witness statements before memories start getting unreliable, or people begin telling different versions of events." "Of course, Sheriff," Beatrice replied with carefully measured professional politeness, though Daisy noticed that the teacher's hands had moved almost imperceptibly toward the locked cabinet in the corner. "This is Miss Daisy Miller, recently arrived from Philadelphia. She was violently attacked by road agents who attempted to rob her of valuable surveying materials belonging to her late father's estate." Magnus's expression grew appropriately serious as he took in the obvious evidence of Daisy's injuries and generally disheveled condition. "That's a very serious matter indeed, miss. Highway robbery is a major territorial offense that carries severe legal penalties under both territorial and federal jurisdiction." His gaze moved deliberately to Hayamovi, who had positioned himself near the window with casual but obvious alertness. "I suppose this individual happened to witness the attack in question." "He saved my life," Daisy said firmly, meeting Magnus's eyes with as much dignity and composure as she could muster, given her bedraggled appearance. "Without Hayamovi's immediate intervention, those criminal road agents would certainly have murdered me after stealing my father's important papers and documents." "Hayamovi," Deputy Pierce repeated slowly, and something in his tone made both Daisy and the Cheyenne warrior look at him with increased sharpness and wariness. "That's a very interesting name with significant cultural meaning. It means High Chief in the Cheyenne language, if I'm not mistaken about tribal linguistic patterns. You wouldn't happen to be related to any of the families that have been causing considerable trouble over traditional hunting rights and water access disputes?" Pierce's question was delivered with apparent casual interest, but his pale eyes remained fixed on Hayamovi with unmistakable predatory intensity, while his fingers unconsciously flexed near his weapon in a gesture that spoke of long-established habits and considerable experience with violent confrontations. "I represent only myself and my own interests," Hayamovi replied with careful diplomatic precision. "I have caused no trouble whatsoever for anyone who demonstrates proper respect for legitimate territorial law and established treaty obligations. Pierce's cold smile widened slightly, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfectly straight for a typical frontier lawman. Legitimate territorial law and established treaty obligations. Those are very interesting phrases carrying considerable legal implications. Your choice of words suggests there might be other kinds of law or alternative treaty interpretations that certain people prefer to follow when it suits their purposes. Before the conversation could grow more tense and potentially dangerous, Magnus intervened with professional authority designed to maintain control of the situation. Now then, Miss Miller, I'll need to personally examine whatever these road agents were attempting to steal from you. Physical evidence will be essential for our official investigation. We certainly can't hope to successfully prosecute dangerous criminals without proper documentation of their intended crimes and motives. Daisy hesitated for several long moments, deeply reluctant to surrender documents that represented not only Robert's life work, but possibly her only hope of seeing his killers brought to justice and his investigations vindicated. But Magnus's considerable bulk effectively filled the doorway, while Pierce's hand remained positioned threateningly near his weapon, and Beatrice's subtle but unmistakable headshake warned strongly against any form of resistance or confrontation. This is completely standard territorial procedure, miss, Pierce added with superficial helpfulness, though his cold eyes clearly suggested that refusing to cooperate would be extremely unwise and possibly dangerous. We'll secure everything safely in our office vault while we conduct our comprehensive manhunt for these criminals. Certainly can't have such important evidence getting lost or damaged during our extensive investigation of this serious crime. With profound reluctance that felt like physical pain, Daisy handed over the leather satchel containing her father's irreplaceable life work. Magnus immediately passed it to Pierce without even a cursory examination, and the deputy made an elaborate show of reviewing its contents with what appeared to be professional thoroughness. His pale eyes lingered significantly on certain documents, much longer than others, paying particular attention to papers bound with red ribbon, which Daisy knew contained the most crucial evidence of Victor's illegal activities. Survey maps and technical drawings, mostly, Pierce announced after completing his deliberately thorough examination of the satchel's contents. Scientific materials that wouldn't particularly interest common thieves looking for easily portable valuables. But these documents would certainly be quite valuable to scholars, government officials, and anyone with interests in territorial land development or resource management. He closed the satchel with decisive finality that suggested the matter was completely settled. We'll keep everything absolutely secure in our office vault during the entire course of our investigation. Approximately how long might that investigation require? Daisy asked, though her sinking heart strongly suggested she already knew what the answer would be. Very difficult to predict with any accuracy, Magnus replied with elaborate expressions of regret and professional concern. Could easily be several weeks, quite possibly months, depending on the complexity of the case. These criminal investigations require absolute thoroughness and attention to detail, especially when they involve complicated territorial jurisdiction questions and potential federal law violations that could affect multiple government agencies. As the two lawmen prepared to depart with their seized evidence, Pierce paused deliberately at the threshold, with his hand resting casually but meaningfully on the door frame. His pale eyes swept the entire schoolhouse one final time, with systematic professional attention, carefully cataloging window placement for future reference. Noting the back door's exact location for tactical planning purposes, and mentally evaluating all possible defensive positions that might be available to the room's current or future occupants. "Miss Miller," he said quietly, his voice carrying subtle undertones that made her skin crawl despite his superficially polite words and concerned expression. I would very strongly recommend exercising considerable caution about discussing the specific details of this incident with other townspeople or casual acquaintances. Criminal road agents quite often have local accomplices and information networks, and spreading detailed information about their methods and targets could seriously endanger our ongoing investigation and potentially put innocent people at risk. The warning was delivered with such apparent genuine concern for her welfare and public safety that it took several seconds for its true meaning to register completely in her mind. When the real implications finally became clear, Daisy felt ice-cold water flowing through her veins as she began to realize the full depth and extent of the corruption they were confronting. We'll certainly be in regular touch regarding our investigative progress and any developments in the case, Magnus added with professional courtesy following his deputy toward the main street and their office. Meanwhile, you folks should definitely avoid taking any unnecessary risks or engaging in potentially dangerous activities while we handle all the complex legal aspects of this serious criminal matter. After the two lawmen had completely disappeared from view toward their office, the schoolhouse somehow felt noticeably smaller and more vulnerable, despite its solid construction and thick walls. Beatrice moved cautiously to the window and watched their retreat with obvious concern and growing anxiety, her face growing pale with what appeared to be genuine fear rather than simple worry. They have Robert's evidence now, Daisy said with unnecessary obviousness, her voice hollow with the terrible certainty of complete defeat. Everything he died trying to document and preserve, simply handed over to the very people he was desperately trying to expose and bring to justice. Not quite everything, Hayamovi said quietly, his calm voice cutting through her despair. During the entire duration of the lawmen's tense visit, he had continued studying Robert's detailed map with focused attention and obvious professional interest. Your father was far too experienced and careful to maintain only one copy of such dangerous evidence. Look closely at these markings here. He pointed to several notations scattered strategically across the map's margins, written in Robert's characteristically precise handwriting, using standard surveyor's abbreviations that would be completely meaningless to casual observers or anyone lacking technical training. Backup cache Echo Canyon, read one carefully disguised notation. Insurance documentation Willow Creek, read another. A third marking near a distinctive geographical feature called Sentinel Rock was cryptically marked, "In final evidence emergency access only." Daisy leaned forward with growing excitement, her heart beginning to race with renewed hope as she slowly deciphered her father's careful planning and foresighted preparations. He actually hid duplicate materials in multiple locations, considerably more than simple duplicates. Hayamovi observed with professional admiration, tracing other subtle markings that clearly indicated Robert's systematic thoroughness and paranoid caution. Your father marked at least 4 completely separate hiding places throughout the territory, each one containing comprehensive copies of his most important and damaging discoveries. Even if Pierce manages to destroy everything he stole from you today, the complete truth remains safely concealed in locations that only Robert documented and that only someone with his technical knowledge could locate and access. Beatrice had been listening intently to their conversation while maintaining her nervous watch at the window for potential surveillance or approaching threats. Now she turned back to face them with decisive authority, though Daisy couldn't help but notice that her hands were trembling, slightly clear evidence of personal stakes in this dangerous conflict that went beyond simple civic duty or professional obligation. Before anyone even considers leaving town to search for hidden evidence, we absolutely must alert federal authorities about what's happening here, Beatrice declared with obvious urgency. Local law enforcement has clearly been completely compromised and corrupted, but territorial corruption of this magnitude definitely falls under federal jurisdiction and requires immediate professional intervention. She moved to her sophisticated telegraph key with practiced efficiency that spoke of considerable experience. But not before glancing nervously toward the window, where she had been anxiously watching for signs of surveillance or hostile observers. Her fingers began dancing over the brass contacts with obvious skill as she composed urgent messages using standard telegraph abbreviations and coded language. "There's something important you both should understand," Beatrice said quietly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she continued working. "I've been receiving increasingly threatening warnings over the past several weeks. Anonymous notes slipped under my door during the night. Mysterious strangers asking the postmaster pointed questions about my telegraph usage patterns, and obvious attempts by unknown individuals to monitor my daily activities and professional correspondence." At exactly 4:17 p.m. on September 15, 1887, her first urgent telegram was transmitted through the Cheyenne Telegraph Office to U.S. Marshal John Patterson, Denver District Office. From B. Hawthorne, Sable, Junction, Wyoming Territory. Urgent federal investigation required territorial corruption. Stop. Local law enforcement completely compromised. Stop. Immediate federal intervention desperately requested. Stop. Possessed documentary evidence, systematic water rights fraud affecting entire territory. Stop. Witness safety critically compromised. Stop. Advise response soonest possible. Stop. "Do you believe he will actually respond to your appeal?" Daisy asked with barely controlled anxiety. "Marshal Patterson has been actively investigating territorial irregularities and suspected corruption for over 2 years. Of our own," Beatrice replied with obvious confidence, continuing to transmit additional messages with practiced efficiency. "He's been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of solid documentary evidence and reliable witness testimony. Your father's meticulous investigation and documentation could provide precisely what he needs to justify comprehensive federal action and intervention." Her second telegram was directed to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Urgent verification required all territorial survey records, Ghost Creek Watershed Region. Stop. Major discrepancies discovered between filed documents versus actual geographical boundaries. Stop. Federal investigation currently pending. Stop. Secure all related documentation immediately. Stop. Additional federal agents en route. Stop. As the September evening gradually settled over Sable Junction with the characteristic high desert chill that reminded all travelers that harsh winter weather was rapidly approaching, and they finalized their dangerous plans with the kind of military precision that frontier survival demanded. Hayamovi possessed intimate personal knowledge of the rugged country surrounding Echo Canyon, having hunted and traveled there regularly since his childhood. Daisy possessed the technical expertise necessary to interpret Robert's specialized surveyor notations and complex technical symbols. Working together in careful coordination, they might just manage to recover sufficient evidence to expose Pierce's extensive criminal network before it could systematically eliminate them and all other potential witnesses. But as they made their final preparations for departure under cover of protective darkness, none of them noticed the shadowy figure watching patiently from the concealment of deep shadows across the street. Deputy Malcolm Pierce himself, his pale eyes taking extremely careful note of their activities and conversations, while his calculating mind methodically planned the next strategic moves in what had become a deadly game of survival and justice. Just after midnight, when Sable Junction had finally settled into the deceptive quiet that typically marked frontier towns, after all, honest citizens had sought their beds for the night, Pierce began making his own careful preparations for what he knew would be the final confrontation. His first stop was Murphy's Saloon, where Greasy Pete sat nursing cheap whiskey and wounded pride that demanded immediate and violent satisfaction. "Time to finish properly what we started this afternoon." Pierce told the injured outlaw, sliding a heavy leather pouch across the saloon's scarred wooden table. The pouch clinked with the distinctive sound of silver territorial coins, hard currency, that spoke much louder than legal authority in places where immediate survival trumped abstract concepts of law and justice. "What about that warrior who interfered with our business?" Pete asked sullenly, gingerly fingering his badly bruised ribs, where Hayamovi's rifle stock had connected with painful and lasting accuracy. "You leave him specifically to me." Pierce replied, his pale eyes reflecting the saloon's lamplight, like chips of winter ice floating on dark water. "I have developed very special plans for anyone foolish enough to interfere directly with legitimate territorial law enforcement activities." His second stop was the town's telegraph office, where the night operator Samuel Kowalski owed his continued employment and personal safety to Pierce's influential recommendations with various territorial officials who controlled such appointments. A series of brief but carefully worded messages to strategically selected recipients in both Cheyenne and Denver would ensure that any federal investigators who might respond to Beatrice's desperate appeals would find themselves indefinitely delayed by mysterious administrative complications and bureaucratic obstacles. Finally, Pierce paid a late-night visit to Sheriff Magnus at his comfortable home on the residential side of town, where the corrupt lawman was enjoying expensive imported brandy and Cuban cigars that his meager official salary could never have afforded under normal circumstances. "We have developed a very serious problem, Clarence," Pierce announced without any preliminary pleasantries, settling himself into Magnus's most expensive chair, with the casual authority of someone completely accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. "The Miller girl has somehow obtained access to evidence that could cause considerable trouble for all of our mutually profitable business arrangements." Magnus set down his crystal snifter with hands that were trembling noticeably, whether from excessive alcohol consumption or increasing nervousness about their situation. Pierce couldn't determine, and frankly didn't care enough to investigate further. "What specific kind of trouble are we potentially facing?" Magnus asked with obvious anxiety. "The kind that inevitably brings federal investigators asking extremely uncomfortable questions about territorial water rights management and the series of unfortunate accidents that have systematically befallen certain troublesome surveyors and their supporters." Pierce's cold smile never wavered or showed any trace of genuine warmth, but his voice carried the bone-chilling quality of winter wind sweeping across empty prairie. "I'm afraid you'll need to take an extended vacation, Clarence. Somewhere considerably far from Sable Junction until this entire situation resolves itself satisfactorily. You can't simply—" Pierce's hand moved with the lightning-fast speed that came from years of practice drawing his Colt's single-action army and placing its cold steel muzzle directly against Magnus's temple before the terrified sheriff could finish his feeble protest. "Actually, I can do exactly that and considerably more if circumstances require it. The only real question remaining is whether you would prefer a comfortable retirement in some distant location or a permanent solution to our communication and security difficulties." Magnus's florid face went deathly pale as he suddenly realized the true nature of his partnership with the deputy he had foolishly believed he controlled and commanded. By the following morning, the sheriff had completely vanished from Sable Junction, his house standing empty except for hastily packed belongings and a brief, cryptic note claiming urgent family business that required his immediate presence in Kansas. Meanwhile, back at the schoolhouse, Beatrice was making her own careful preparations for the dangerous days that lay ahead. Her locked cabinet contained considerably more than simple medical supplies and advanced educational textbooks. Hidden behind a cunningly constructed false back were numerous photographs, meticulously copied documents, and extensive correspondence that represented many months of careful investigation into territorial corruption and systematic criminal activity. Her sophisticated telegraph key was connected not merely to the main territorial communication line, but also to a private network that linked honest government officials scattered throughout the Western Territories. The urgent message to Marshal Patterson was only the first of several communications that would alert federal authorities to the systematic fraud being perpetrated under the convenient cover of legitimate territorial law enforcement. As she worked steadily through the night, copying crucial documents and preparing comprehensive evidence packages for multiple destinations, Beatrice found herself reflecting on the extremely high personal price that justice demanded in a place where honest government remained a luxury that very few people could afford to pursue. Her younger brother Thomas had already paid the ultimate price with his life for attempting to expose territorial corruption. Now others would inevitably be called upon to risk everything in pursuit of the same dangerous but essential truth. But some fights were worth any conceivable sacrifice, and the restoration of honest law to Wyoming territory was unquestionably such a cause. Tomorrow would certainly bring new dangers and potentially deadly challenges, but tonight she would do absolutely everything within her power to ensure that Robert Miller's irreplaceable evidence would survive to serve the greater cause of justice and legitimate government. At dawn on September 16, 1887, Daisy and Hayamovi slipped quietly out of Sable Junction by using obscure back trails and livestock paths, taking advantage of pre-dawn darkness and the warriors' intimate knowledge of local terrain to avoid the main roads where Pierce's hired gunmen would certainly be watching for any sign of their movement. They rode together on Hayamovi's powerful paint horse, maintaining a steady but sustainable pace through the broken country that surrounded the town, like a complex maze constructed from stone, sand, and hardy vegetation. The morning air was crisp and clear, with a particular atmospheric clarity typical of high desert regions, making the distant snow-capped mountains seem close enough to reach out and touch with an extended hand. A thin but persistent wind carried the unmistakable scent of approaching winter down from the elevated peaks, mixed with subtler odors of wildlife water and the countless plants that survived in this harsh environment through adaptation and patience. 3 miles north of town, at a distinctive wind-carved sandstone formation that served as a natural landmark, Hayamovi paused their journey to construct a small but highly visible signal fire using carefully selected dried grass and aged buffalo chips. The resulting smoke rose perfectly straight in the still morning air, creating a column visible for many miles in the clear atmospheric conditions. To untrained white observers, the smoke might appear completely random and meaningless. But to experienced Cheyenne observers positioned at strategic locations throughout the territory, it carried a very specific and urgent message. High Chief's son rides south with white allies seeking justice for murdered kinsmen and stolen tribal lands. Will they be able to understand your signal? Daisy asked with obvious anxiety, watching the smoke column dissipate gradually into the vast morning sky. My sister Winona maintains watch from our people's winter camp, located approximately 12 miles to the north. Hayamovi replied with calm confidence, already urging his paint horse toward the distant formations that marked Echo Canyon's location. She will immediately gather available warriors and follow our trail at maximum speed. If we are forced to face Pierce's hired gunmen completely alone, we will almost certainly die in the attempt. But if we face them with proper Cheyenne military support, we will have a genuine fighting chance for survival and success. They reached Echo Canyon's dramatic rim, just as the climbing sun approached its zenith position, transforming the ancient sandstone walls into towering pillars of gold and deep crimson that seemed to glow with their own internal fire. The canyon itself was a spectacular natural amphitheater, carved over countless millennia by persistent water action, its floor dotted with mature cottonwood trees that clearly marked the creek's original course before human interference altered its flow. But what they discovered beneath the largest and most ancient of those cottonwood trees confirmed Daisy's worst fears about the brutal manner of her adoptive father's death, and the systematic nature of the violence that had been used to cover up territorial corruption. Dark stains marked the sandy soil in unmistakable patterns that could only represent human blood that had soaked deep into the earth and dried under weeks of exposure to weather and the elements. Scattered around these ominous stains were numerous fragments of violence, brass uniform buttons torn from clothing during a struggle, a broken knife blade embedded deeply in the cottonwood's bark, and pieces of leather equipment that had once been part of someone's personal gear. Wedged securely between the ancient tree's gnarled and weathered roots was Robert's surveyor's compass, its familiar brass case severely dented and scratched, but still functionally intact. Daisy recognized the instrument immediately, and without any doubt, her adoptive father had carried that particular compass on every single professional assignment for more than 20 years, treating it like a sacred talisman that connected him spiritually to the ancient and honorable craft of measuring and mapping the world with mathematical precision. "He died right here," she whispered with profound emotion, kneeling carefully beside the tragic evidence and cradling the recovered compass in her trembling hands. "Right here in this exact spot, trying desperately to document irrefutable proof of Pierce's extensive criminal activities." Hayamovi had been methodically examining the entire area with the systematic attention of someone extensively trained in reading stories written in disturbed earth-scattered debris and other subtle signs that most people would dismiss as completely meaningless. "Two men died here together," he corrected gently but with absolute certainty. "One white man and one Cheyenne, fighting side by side against common enemies until the very end." He carefully guided her to another location nearby, where patient examination revealed moccasin footprints mixed intimately with boot tracks. Both distinct patterns ending ultimately in the same dark stains that marked the cottonwood's base. Hidden beneath a carefully arranged pile of stones that had been positioned to appear completely natural was a brass concho traditional decorative metalwork that had once adorned authentic Cheyenne ceremonial clothing. But someone had used a sharp knife point to scratch crude letters into the brass surface, with desperate urgency forming words that were barely legible, even in the clear morning light. "Malcolm Pierce, murderer of innocence." "Talon." Hayamovi said, his voice thick with carefully controlled emotion as he traced the scratched letters with one finger. "My young cousin used his final moments of life to identify his killer beyond any possible doubt, carving the absolute truth into metal that would survive long after his voice had been permanently silenced." The full implications of their discovery staggered Daisy as she began to realize the complete scope and systematic nature of Pierce's criminal activities. The deputy wasn't merely a corrupt lawman who occasionally accepted bribes or looked the other way when convenient. He was a cold-blooded systematic killer who methodically eliminated anyone who threatened his extensive illegal operation, then used his official position and legal authority to cover up his crimes and avoid any consequences for his actions. They spent the next 4 hours conducting a thorough and methodical search of Echo Canyon, according to Robert's cryptic map notations and technical references work that proved both physically demanding and extremely dangerous. The canyon was riddled with hidden crevices, where venomous rattlesnakes sought shelter from the intense daytime heat, unstable rock formations that could collapse without warning and crush anyone beneath them, and numerous caves that might conceal anything from harmless bats to aggressive mountain lions seeking cool refuge from the desert sun. But Robert's extensive surveyor training and professional experience had served him extremely well even in the desperate task of concealing evidence from his killers and their systematic search efforts. His chosen hiding places demonstrated the kind of technical ingenuity that could only come from years of professional geological knowledge, sealed crevices that had been disguised to appear like completely natural rock formations, carefully hollowed spaces concealed behind apparently solid stone facades and chambers that would be accessible only to someone who thoroughly understood the geological principles that Robert had learned and applied during the decades of territorial mapping work. In the fourth location, they systematically searched a small cave hidden behind the greatly reduced waterfall that had once thundered magnificently through the canyon. Before Victor's illegal dam stole most of its natural power, they finally discovered Robert's carefully prepared insurance against exactly the kind of situation they currently faced. The hidden chamber was small, but had been kept perfectly dry through Robert's careful engineering, sealed with stonework so skillfully crafted that it appeared to be nothing more than natural cave-in rather than deliberate human construction. Inside this secure space were several oiled leather portfolios containing dozens of documents, photographs, and technical materials that represented the final months of Robert's dangerous but thorough investigation into territorial corruption. He managed to document absolutely everything. Daisy breathed with amazement and growing excitement, carefully spreading the precious papers across a flat stone surface, while Hayamovi maintained vigilant watch at the cave entrance. Not just Victor's illegal dam construction and water theft, but Pierce's entire network of territorial corruption, systematic bribery, and organized criminal activity. The recovered evidence was absolutely overwhelming in both its scope and mathematical precision. Robert had systematically photographed boundary stones that had been moved from their legal positions, created exact copies of forged territorial documents, and even obtained sworn affidavits from multiple witnesses who had personally observed various illegal activities. His meticulous documentation revealed systematic fraud extending throughout Wyoming territory, and possibly beyond, involving not only water rights theft, but also mining claims manipulation, railroad land grant, corruption, and systematic bribery of territorial appointments. Among the carefully preserved papers was Robert's final personal letter to her, sealed with red wax, and bearing her name written in his characteristically meticulous handwriting. My dearest daughter, if you are reading this letter, then my investigation has ultimately cost me my life. But the truth has survived to serve the cause of justice. Do not grieve for me longer than necessary. I have lived a full and meaningful life and died in service of principles that are worth any conceivable sacrifice. The evidence carefully preserved in this cache represents 8 months of extremely dangerous investigative work. But it is both complete and legally sufficient for exposing territorial corruption at every level of government. Present these documents directly to Marshal John Patterson in Denver. He alone among all federal officials has consistently proven immune to bribery, intimidation, and political pressure. You have grown into a woman of remarkable courage, unshakable principle, and admirable determination qualities that will serve you extremely well in the difficult trials that lie ahead. Trust your natural instincts, completely rely on honorable allies whenever possible. And always remember that justice delayed is definitely not justice denied. The compass I gave you points reliably toward magnetic north, but your own conscience will always point toward true justice. Follow both faithfully, and you will never lose your way in this world's confusion and moral complexity. With all my love, pride, and confidence in your future, Robert Miller. Post-scriptum. The legal adoption papers that formalize our relationship are properly filed with Territorial Judge Morrison in Cheyenne, along with my last will and testament, designating you as sole heir to my surveying practice and all professional materials. You are my daughter in every sense that truly matters, and no earthly authority can ever alter that fundamental truth. As Daisy finished reading through tears that blurred her vision and made the handwriting temporarily difficult to decipher, she heard something that instantly transformed her gratitude and relief into mortal terror. The unmistakable sound of multiple horses approaching through the canyon with the confident pace of riders who knew exactly where their intended quarry would be found and had no concern about being detected. "They've somehow discovered our location," Hayamovi said grimly quickly, checking his Spencer carbine's action, while systematically scanning the towering canyon walls for defensive positions that might offer even temporary shelter from superior numbers. Someone must have successfully followed our trail from town, despite our precautions. But as the approaching riders came into clear view around the canyon's bend, Daisy realized with sinking heart that their situation was actually far worse than a simple pursuit by local criminals. Deputy Malcolm Pierce was personally leading a group of 7 heavily armed men, his pale eyes gleaming with obvious satisfaction as he systematically surveyed their completely trapped position with professional tactical assessment. Riding behind him were not only Greasy Pete and Deadshot, both clearly eager for violent revenge against the people who had humiliated them during yesterday's failed ambush, but also several other hard-looking men who had the unmistakable appearance of professional killers rather than simple frontier criminals. "Miss Miller," Pierce called out across the canyon floor in a voice that managed to combine cheerful politeness with unmistakable menace. "What an unexpected but genuine pleasure to encounter you here in such a remote location. Though I must express considerable disappointment that you chose not to trust local law enforcement with the proper handling of your late father's remaining effects and personal property." He dismounted from his horse with casual confidence and obvious tactical experience, his right hand resting meaningfully on his pistol grip, while his hired gunmen efficiently spread out to surround all possible escape routes with professional competence. Each movement demonstrated the kind of tactical expertise that could only come from years of frontier violence disguised as legitimate law enforcement activity. The towering canyon walls rose more than 300 feet on all sides, offering extremely limited climbing routes that would be challenging even for experienced climbers under ideal conditions. The narrow creek bed provided some temporary cover from direct fire, but offered absolutely no practical escape route. Pierce's strategic positioning had been calculated with mathematical precision to eliminate any possibility of successful flight from the canyon. "You see, Miss Miller," Pierce continued in the same conversationally pleasant tone, "evidence of the type you've been collecting can prove extremely dangerous when it falls into untrained hands or is misinterpreted by people who lack proper understanding of complex legal and territorial matters. Fortunately, Deputy Pierce is here to ensure that all territorial property remains exactly where it belongs, under appropriate official supervision and legal control." The tactical situation appeared completely hopeless from any conventional military perspective. They were outnumbered 7-2, trapped in a natural fortress with limited cover and no apparent escape routes. Pierce held every conceivable advantage of position, superior numbers, heavy weapons, and official legal authority that would justify whatever level of violence he deemed necessary to resolve the situation permanently. But Hayamovi had survived to reach adulthood in a harsh world where Cheyenne warriors regularly faced seemingly impossible odds as a matter of routine survival. And through that experience, he had learned that even the most desperate situations sometimes offered unexpected opportunities for those who possessed sufficient boldness and tactical creativity to recognize and seize them. His first carefully aimed shot took Greasy Pete cleanly from his saddle before the outlaw could bring his own weapon to bear. The Spencer carbine's heavy slug punched through Pete's chest with devastating effect, dropping him beside the creek with a loud splash that echoed dramatically off the surrounding stone walls. Hayamovi's second shot fired while he was already rolling behind the protective cover of a fallen log, completely shattered Deadshot's right shoulder and sent the wounded man's return fire wild into empty air and harmless stone. "Run," Hayamovi shouted urgently to Daisy while working his rifle's lever action with practiced efficiency. Take all the papers we recovered and try to reach high ground where you can find better defensive positions. But Daisy had learned during the recent days of danger and violence that survival in this harsh country required personal initiative and quick decision-making, rather than passive obedience to other people's commands, regardless of how well-intentioned those commands might be. She quickly grabbed Robert's most crucial documents and evidence, stuffing the precious papers securely inside her coat, while simultaneously scanning the towering canyon walls for potential climbing routes that her father's geological training had taught her to recognize and evaluate. Pierce's remaining hired gunmen were systematically closing in from 3 different directions, their rifles creating bright orange muzzle flashes in the afternoon shadows as they poured concentrated fire toward the cottonwood grove, where their intended victims had taken whatever cover was available. But the deputy himself had moved with tactical precision to intercept Daisy's most obvious escape route, his pale eyes bright with anticipation of personally settling accounts that had grown frustratingly complicated and dangerously public. "You have caused me considerable trouble and expense, Miss Miller," he said in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather raising his Colt single-action army, with the practiced precision that came from years of frontier violence. "I believe it's definitely time to resolve this particular territorial matter permanently and completely." That was precisely the moment when Echo Canyon suddenly erupted with traditional war cries that seemed to emerge directly from the ancient stone walls themselves, voices carrying a mixture of ancestral fury and modern grievances that had been building toward this confrontation for generations. Winona led the dramatic assault, guiding her war pony down the treacherous canyon trail with riding skills that seemed to defy every natural law of physics and balance. Her repeating rifle spoke with deadly accuracy as she charged at full speed, each carefully placed shot dropping one of Pierce's hired gunmen before they could properly adjust their tactics to deal with this completely unexpected threat from an entirely different direction. Behind her came 3 experienced Cheyenne warriors, whose sudden presence transformed the tactical situation absolutely and completely. Pierce's professional gunmen, who had confidently expected nothing more challenging than a simple execution of trapped civilians, suddenly found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire between desperate but determined defenders and experienced tribal fighters who were actively seeking violent vengeance for their murdered kinsmen and stolen tribal lands. In the chaos and confusion that immediately followed, Daisy attempted to make her escape by climbing up the canyon's eastern wall using handholds and ledges that would have been completely invisible to anyone lacking her father's specialized training in geological formations and rock structure analysis. Below her current position, intense gunfire echoed like continuous thunder, while men shouted urgent orders and fierce battle cries in 2 different languages, their voices mixing with the sharp crack of rifle fire and the terrified screams of wounded horses caught in the crossfire. She had successfully climbed nearly 40 feet toward relative safety when sudden disaster struck in the form of loose stone and inadequate handholds caused by natural weathering processes. A ledge that had appeared solid suddenly crumbled beneath her full weight, sending her sliding helplessly back down the canyon wall in a dangerous shower of sharp gravel and broken sandstone fragments that lacerated her hands severely and tore her traveling dress into ribbons. Through desperate effort and considerable luck, she managed to arrest her fall by catching herself on a narrow shelf approximately 20 feet above the canyon floor. But her left ankle twisted painfully during the violent impact, and several of Robert's precious documents scattered during her uncontrolled descent, some catching temporarily on small rock projections, while others fluttered down toward the creek where they would be lost forever in the swift current. Pierce had witnessed her mishap from his position below and was already beginning to climb methodically toward her trapped location, his pistol securely holstered to leave both hands completely free for the technical demands of rock climbing. His pale eyes held the cold satisfaction of an experienced predator that had finally cornered particularly elusive prey after an entertaining but ultimately futile chase. "This is definitely the end of our extended chase, Miss Miller." He called up to her with obvious satisfaction, his voice carrying easily in the thin canyon air. "Though I must say you have provided considerably more amusement and challenge than I initially anticipated. Your adoptive father would undoubtedly be proud of your determination and resourcefulness, if not your ultimate judgment in choosing to oppose established authority." Below their precarious positions, the fierce battle was gradually winding down as Hayamovi and his Cheyenne military allies systematically eliminated Pierce's remaining hired gunmen with coordinated tactical precision. But the corrupt deputy would certainly reach Daisy's defenseless position long before any possible help could arrive to assist her, and her painfully injured ankle made any further climbing attempts completely impossible. She was effectively trapped and helpless, with absolutely nowhere to retreat, and no weapons available except Robert's recovered compass and her own desperate courage born of necessity. Pierce was now only 15 feet below her position, and climbing steadily upward, taking his time because he was absolutely certain that she had completely exhausted all options for escape or meaningful resistance. But as he reached confidently for the next secure handhold in his methodical ascent, Daisy suddenly remembered something extremely important that Robert had taught her during their many surveying expeditions together. That thorough understanding of geological formations and natural rock structure could sometimes save your life, like in ways that went far beyond simple navigation and route finding. Robert's scattered field notes, which she had studied carefully during their recovery, included several specific technical observations about this particular canyon. Sandstone ledges above creek level throughout this region show extensive freeze-thaw damage, creating characteristic vertical fractures that indicate serious structural weakness. Where water penetration creates dangerous expansion pressure during winter, freezing cycles resulting in progressive deterioration of load-bearing capacity. That makes apparently solid rock formations extremely treacherous for climbing or construction purposes. The particular ledge that Pierce was currently using for his ascent showed unmistakable evidence of exactly such natural damage. Hairline cracks running vertically through the stone structure, slight discoloration indicating chronic water penetration and chemical weakening, and the telltale signs of expansion damage that made seemingly solid rock dangerously unstable under any significant stress or impact. Daisy carefully pulled her small surveyor's hammer from her coat pocket, a specialized geological tool that Robert had given her specifically for collecting rock samples during field expeditions and technical analysis work. If she could manage to strike the critical stress point where freeze-thaw damage had systematically weakened the ledge's fundamental structural integrity, she aimed with mathematical precision and brought the hammer down with every ounce of her remaining physical strength at the exact spot that Robert's extensive training had taught her to recognize as the point of maximum geological vulnerability. The impact was relatively minimal by itself, but it proved sufficient to trigger a catastrophic cascade failure in stone that had already been seriously compromised by decades of natural weathering processes and structural deterioration. Pierce's eyes widened with sudden comprehension and growing terror as he felt the ledge shifting ominously beneath his full weight, but he was far too committed to his current position to change course safely or find alternative handholds. The entire sandstone shelf collapsed in a grinding roar of falling debris and pulverized stone, carrying the corrupt deputy down into the canyon's depths far below their positions. His scream echoed off the ancient walls with gradually diminishing intensity until it was cut abruptly short by the sickening sound of final impact, followed immediately by the splash of something heavy striking the creek's shallow waters and then falling into permanent silence forever. On September 21, 1887, exactly 5 days after Pierce's violent death in Echo Canyon, U.S. Marshal John Patterson arrived in Sable Junction aboard the morning eastbound train from Denver, accompanied by 3 experienced deputy marshals and a territorial prosecutor who specialized in corruption cases. His journey had required precisely 2 full days by railroad transportation to reach Cheyenne, followed by 3 additional days of difficult travel by horseback across challenging mountain terrain, exactly the response time that Beatrice's urgent telegraph message had accurately predicted when she had warned that federal help would not be able to arrive immediately. Patterson was a silver-haired veteran law enforcement officer with more than 30 years of frontier experience carved into his deeply weathered features, and he examined Robert's systematically recovered evidence with growing amazement that such comprehensive documentation had somehow managed to survive the extensive conspiracy it so thoroughly exposed. This represents absolutely extraordinary investigative work, he told Daisy with genuine professional admiration as his federal deputies methodically processed the canyon crime scene with thorough attention to detail. This collection provides not merely adequate proof of local water rights fraud, but comprehensive documentation of territorial corruption that clearly extends all the way to the capital itself and possibly beyond territorial boundaries. Beatrice had traveled with the federal investigators from town, her systematic telegraph messages having successfully reached honest government officials who possessed both the authority and the determination to coordinate rapid response to territorial emergencies of this magnitude. She had already organized detailed testimony from dozens of Sable Junction residents who had been systematically intimidated into silence, while Pierce maintained complete control over local law enforcement through violence and corruption. The full scope of corruption revealed through systematic federal investigation staggered even experienced investigators who had seen similar cases throughout the Western Territories. Pierce had been methodically eliminating perceived threats for more than 3 years, gradually building an extensive network of bribery, intimidation, and systematic murder that reached into the territorial legislature itself and possibly into federal appointments as well. Victor Mendez was arrested at his stamp mill operation while desperately attempting to destroy crucial business records and financial documentation, and under intensive federal questioning combined with the overwhelming evidence of his systematic criminal activity, he provided a detailed confession that implicated dozens of territorial officials in organized fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. Malcolm Pierce functioned as the operational center and coordinator for the entire criminal network. Patterson explained to the assembled witnesses who had gathered in the packed Sable Junction schoolhouse for his preliminary report. He systematically coordinated multiple murders, managed extensive bribery networks throughout the territory, and used his official badge and legal authority to eliminate anyone who threatened the conspiracy's enormous profits. Your father, Miss Hawthorne's brother, Hayamovi's young cousin. They all died because they possessed specific information that would have exposed serious crimes reaching the highest levels of territorial government and possibly federal appointments. Sheriff Magnus had completely vanished from the territory, presumably fleeing toward distant state borders before federal arrest warrants could be properly issued and served. His hastily abandoned house contained extensive evidence of a lifestyle far beyond any legitimate official salary, including detailed correspondence with territorial appointees that conclusively confirmed the systematic nature of corruption throughout Wyoming's governmental structure. On October 15, 1887, in the territorial courthouse at Cheyenne, where Judge Harrison Morrison presided over what would become the most significant corruption trials in Wyoming's entire history, justice finally began its slow but absolutely inexorable process of restoration and legal accountability. The evidence that has been presented to this court, Judge Morrison announced to the packed courtroom filled with interested citizens, newspaper reporters, and government officials, demonstrates systematic violation of territorial law, federal statutes, and basic human decency, on a scale that challenges our fundamental assumptions about honest government. The defendants will face penalties that are appropriate to the full magnitude of their crimes, against honest government, innocent citizens, and the rule of law itself. Victor Mendez received a sentence of 15 years in federal custody to be served at a designated state penitentiary operating under federal contract for conspiracy, systematic fraud, and accessory to multiple murders. His extensive business assets were completely seized under territorial forfeiture laws, with all proceeds specifically designated for victim compensation and essential territorial infrastructure improvements that would benefit honest citizens rather than corrupt officials. Comprehensive federal court orders mandated immediate and extensive modification of Victor's illegal dam construction, requiring carefully scheduled water releases that would restore Ghost Creek's natural flow patterns, while still allowing continued operation of legitimate mining activities under strict territorial safety regulations and permanent federal oversight designed to prevent future abuse. The systematic theft of water rights that had impoverished honest farmers and violated solemn tribal treaties was finally ending through proper legal processes rather than frontier vigilante violence, establishing important precedents for honest resource management throughout the American West. Regarding the critically important matter of water rights allocation for the entire Ghost Creek watershed, Judge Morrison continued with obvious satisfaction. This court hereby appoints Miss Daisy Miller as official custodian of all territorial surveying records for this region, with full legal authority to ensure accurate documentation of all future water allocations according to established prior appropriation doctrine and existing treaty obligations with Cheyenne tribal authorities. While this appointment didn't carry the sweeping environmental authority that would characterize modern resource management, it represented real legal power to prevent future corruption while serving the cause of honest government and equitable resource distribution. More importantly, it represented official recognition that justice sometimes required extraordinary measures and unconventional solutions that challenged traditional assumptions about governmental authority. Furthermore, the judge added with evident approval, Mr. Hayamovi of the Cheyenne Nation is hereby appointed as official community liaison, with full authority to ensure that traditional tribal water usage patterns are properly respected in all future allocation decisions, and that tribal authorities receive appropriate consultation regarding any territorial development affecting traditional lands and resources. The comprehensive legal framework established by federal court intervention created systematic oversight mechanisms specifically designed to prevent any return of the corruption that had nearly destroyed Wyoming's territorial government. Water releases from the modified dam were now scheduled according to seasonal agricultural needs, spring snowmelt directed toward essential irrigation for farming communities, summer flows carefully maintained for livestock and tribal usage, autumn conservation for winter reserves, and monitored continuously by both territorial officials and tribal representatives through detailed monthly reports filed with federal authorities. Blue Eyes, the honest railroad worker who had provided crucial testimony during the extensive trials, was officially appointed as federal water monitor with full authority to ensure that all dam operations complied strictly with court orders and federal regulations. His monthly reports to both territorial and federal authorities created a permanent record specifically designed to prevent any future manipulation of water releases for private profit. Mining operations throughout Wyoming Territory now required regular federal safety inspections and complete environmental compliance with established standards. Most importantly, for long-term governmental integrity, all territorial surveying work became subject to independent verification procedures designed to prevent the kind of fraudulent boundary manipulation that had enabled systematic theft of public resources for private gain. For Daisy personally, the trial's successful conclusion brought both emotional closure regarding her father's murder and significant new professional responsibility for continuing his important work. Judge Morrison's official recognition of Robert's legal adoption papers established her unquestioned standing as his legitimate daughter and legal heir to his surveying practice unprecedented authority. For any woman in territorial society, but fully justified by her unique knowledge of the complex case that had restored honest law to Wyoming territory. As autumn gradually settled over Wyoming territory, and the first significant snow began dusting the mountains surrounding Sable Junction, with White Daisy stood beside the restored Ghost Creek, watching clear water flow freely for the first time in several years. Victor's stamp mill continued operating under strict federal supervision, but its profits were no longer built on stolen resources, murdered witnesses, and systematic corruption of territorial government. The extensive corruption that had systematically infected territorial governance at every level was now being methodically dismantled through proper legal processes and federal oversight. Ongoing federal investigations continued uncovering evidence of bribery networks extending throughout Wyoming's territorial administration, while honest officials worked diligently to rebuild essential institutions that served legitimate public interests rather than private greed and criminal conspiracy. Hayamovi joined her beside the restored water, his new role as community liaison, having successfully established Cheyenne rights that had been systematically ignored and violated for far too long. Together, they had created something genuinely unprecedented in frontier history. A working partnership based on mutual respect, shared commitment to justice, and practical cooperation that could survive whatever future challenges might arise. Your adoptive father would be extremely proud of what you have accomplished, he said quietly, watching the clear water flow over stones that had been completely dry for 3 long years. I hope so with all my heart, Daisy replied carefully, pulling Robert's recovered compass from her coat pocket. The precious instrument had been professionally repaired and polished to its original condition, and someone had thoughtfully engraved meaningful new words around its traditional directional markings: truth north, justice east, courage south, hope west. What happens now? She asked, though extensive recent experience had taught her that the future was rarely predictable in frontier territories, where survival depended on adapting quickly to rapidly changing circumstances. We continue the important work we have been given, Hayamovi answered with quiet determination. We protect honest law enforcement whenever possible, serve justice when circumstances permit, and work steadily to build something significantly better than what we originally found. It wasn't a romantic declaration or promise of marriage. Such personal commitments belong to different stories, told under different circumstances and social conditions. But it represented something more valuable and practical in their harsh world. A commitment to shared principles, mutual respect, and working partnership that could weather whatever storms or challenges might arise in the difficult years ahead. The work that lay before them would certainly be difficult and sometimes extremely dangerous. There were still corrupt officials to expose and remove from positions of authority, still honest government institutions to build and maintain, still damaged communities to heal from years of systematic abuse and exploitation. But comprehensive federal oversight had successfully created a legal framework for honest administration, while maintaining that honesty would require constant vigilance from dedicated people like themselves and Hayamovi. Each individual water allocation decision, each surveying project, each territorial appointment would need careful monitoring and oversight to prevent any return of the corruption that had nearly destroyed Wyoming's territorial government and threatened the lives and livelihoods of honest citizens throughout the region. The legal precedents established through their successful case would serve as a foundation for honest governance throughout the American West, demonstrating that justice was possible, even in the most challenging frontier conditions when good people found the courage to stand together against systematic corruption. That evening, as Sable Junction settled peacefully into sleep under brilliant stars that had witnessed far too much violence, but now looked down on a community actively rebuilding itself on solid foundations of law rather than corruption. Daisy reflected deeply on the profound lessons learned through blood sacrifice and unwavering determination to see justice done. Justice was definitely possible on the frontier, but it required exceptional courage from ordinary people willing to risk everything in pursuit of truth and honest government. Legitimate government could certainly exist in territorial wilderness, but only when good citizens consistently refused to accept corruption as inevitable or unchangeable. In her coat pocket, the compass needle swung true to its eternal magnetic bearing, while her heart followed its own moral direction toward whatever tomorrow might demand of those who deliberately chose justice over comfort, truth over convenience, and courage over fear. The surveyor's daughter had become something that Robert never could have imagined but would have recognized immediately. A dedicated guardian of the crucial boundary between civilization and chaos. Measuring truth with the same mathematical precision he had once used for measuring mountains, rivers, and the honest claims of honest people. And in a territory where such guardians had been desperately needed for far too long, that was perhaps the most valuable surveying work of all.